Everything that's inside of us is part of our writing process. That doesn't mean we're going to write about it. But if I'm sad, I need to sit there and say, yeah, I'm writing sad. I'm sitting here, I'm sad, and I'm going to write. And I'm going to see what sad writing brings today. Instead of being like, no, I've got to get myself into a different mood to be able to write. No, I'm writing as me. I'm a whole person. And I have to sit here as a whole person and, see what comes out of that person today.
Some experts chase attention, but the smart ones build authority. You're listening to the Authority on Demand podcast, where credibility becomes your competitive advantage. Every week, we're pulling back the curtain on how founders and leaders turn expertise into inbound demand through books that position, media that converse, and strategies that actually move the needle. I'm Danielle Hutchinson, your host and Chief Creative Officer at Authority on Demand. Now, let's turn your authority into leverage.
So, every author knows the myth of the isolated genius, locked away in an attic, emerging months later with a masterpiece. But what if that story is not only false, but actually harmful to our creative processes? Welcome to Authors on Mission, the podcast that reveals the real strategies behind breakthrough success. I'm Danielle Hutchinson, Chief Creative Officer here at Authors on Mission, and today we're exploring why the most powerful creative work happens not in isolation, but in connection. Our guest, Alexandra Beller, compares the artistic community to the underground fungal networks that keep entire forests alive. Invisible, but absolutely essential. As a choreographer, director, and author of The Anatomy of Art, Alexandra has discovered the key to unlocking our creative potential lies not just in what we write, but how we connect, collaborate, and cultivate the relationships that sustain our arts. So, without further ado, Alexandra, welcome to our show.
Thank you so much.
Hey, real quick before we jump back in, if you're loving what we're doing here, hit that subscribe button and drop us a like. We're bringing you the best authors, the most real conversations, and all the writing wisdom that you didn't know you needed. So stick around because it only gets better from here. All right, now let's get back to the conversation.
Looking forward to this one because, one thing that I always say to people is that people think that writing is an isolated process, a solitary process, because you're sitting and typing or writing with a pen, and we fail to understand that it is community driven. So I love what you're doing here with this book.
Thank you.
Of course. I always like to start off talking a little bit about yourself. Can you tell us about your path, and how you ended up deciding, you know what, I have to write this book? Because, you were a choreographer and a director for over 25 years. What drew you to the writing world?
So I was a performer for a long time. I got the bug to create. I started choreographing, started a dance company, got the bug to move to theater, was choreographing in theater. And I was working with a lot of artists on their art. So I was doing a lot of coaching and mentorship and running workshops where I'm helping artists to find their own voice. And a lot of the frameworks I was using for feedback came from Liz Lerman, who developed something called critical response process. And one of the steps in critical response process is you ask a lot of questions, but the questions are very crafted. And they're crafted towards neutrality, but not towards a lack of challenge, meaning the questions want to be fully challenging, but they don't want to be steeped in an opinion. So, this process of letting go of opinion while still trying to challenge artists was a many, many years long process that I was going through as a mentor. And in that process, I was noticing the effect that some of these questions would have on our room full of artists. And I would, have seen somebody's artwork. We would all have just watched a sharing showing, and then they'd look at me like, what do you think? And I would say, here's what I'm curious about. What is the relationship between da da da? Or have you thought about da da da? And you could just feel that sometimes you'd ask a question and the room would just enliven and awaken. And the artist, it's almost like a cartoon could see a light bulb over their head and would say, that's that's what I need to think about. And it wasn't that's what I need to do. Oh, I'll take your advice. It was like, oh, that unlocked something in me, a way to solve a problem I've been having, instead of me coming in as somebody with a bunch of choreographic experience of my own and saying, you know what you should do? You know what would be good? You know what would work? No, I would say, what is this trying to do? How is this operating? And so I felt like, I should write down these questions. And so I started to write down the questions and I thought, oh, I'll write a book of 1,000 questions for artists. But that just ultimately didn't feel, I felt like it needs a statement to questions in this context lack the vulnerability that I want to live by. So I was like, okay, you need to write a statement too. So I started writing essays. And then I looked around at a certain point a couple years ago and I was like, you've written a lot of other things too about art. You know, I write very content heavy essays for emails and I write essays for this artistic community I'm in. And I was like, let me just gather them up and just see what is happening here. And when I just was holding all the material in my hand, I felt like this is a book. And so then I started putting it together in earnest. But really, it's been collecting itself for 8 years.
Understood. So it's really just a process that keeps going and keeps rewarding itself as you, continuously work on it. So it's really exciting. And one thing that I wanted to, chat about regarding the book is the fact that you, of course, compare the artistic community to the forest. And that you did touch upon this a little bit, but I'm wondering if you could talk about that a little bit more. How exactly does that translate into the written word? I'm sure there was a lot of like planning behind each of these pieces that you were writing as you went along the way. Is that right?
In terms of how does community feed itself into writing? Is that
Exactly. Yeah, yeah.
well, it relates a lot to the my ideal reader is probably a choreographer, a director, maybe a dramaturg, actor, dancer. But probably most of the readers are going to be people who either teach choreographers and directors or are one themselves or some hybrid form. Um, and both teaching and being at the helm of a creative ship, a performance ship, are both pretty lonely places to be. Even though you're in community, you're not in that kind of sense of community where people are giving you feedback and challenging you directly. And I think writing can be similar. And of course, all of these people can go out and find mentors and groups and, places where they get feedback. But naturally, the job itself of a choreographer, of a director, of a teacher, and a writer are all these like slightly isolated places. And
Mhm.
yet, dance and theater and teaching, you end up with a built-in group of people around you. They're just not necessarily feeding you the way that you need to be fed in terms of your own growth. And so I felt like, well, how, as a choreographer, did I ingest a feeling of the community being able to change me? And most of it was about releasing some of the ways that I hold control over how things are going to go. And that was one of the most translatable, transferable um, revelations for me as a writer, that I was sitting there and writing and feeling like I can't determine the outcome of this essay right now. I need to let the essay start to become what it wants to be. And as I started to release the control over the outcome of the writing, all of these other voices and experiences and interactions with people started coming back into my body, and those started coming back into the writing. So things that people would have said to me over the years and other people's writing and anecdotes and places that relationships that I've had all started to become more available to me in my writing as I started to release the control over where the piece would end up. And of course, I go back with a lot of fine tooth comb and a lot of control and, clear eyes when I edit. But I started writing in this very intuitive way. And I found that when I did that, all of the people that I was in connection with and had been throughout my life felt like they rose up in my imagination and in my body. And I felt communal. Even sitting in my bed with my little laptop desk alone in my room, I felt the presence of all these other ideas and people. And I think that was where that feeling of mycelium came from. Like all these people have like grown into my system, and wherever they are, I feel like they move me now.
Of course, I love that. And I guess that kind of lends itself to what you call in your book the micro communities and the witness circles that you mentioned as strategies for cultivating this if somebody else were to follow in your footsteps. Why don't you like to walk us through that? What exactly is a witness circle and a micro community?
Well, it can be anything you want. It can be
Hmm.
co-working with a friend over Zoom, right? It's not a spiritual passage. It's just like, how are ways that I can find a bit of connection, like a micro community, is also um, talking to somebody on a park bench, or, you know, chatting with somebody as you're working at a cafe, is building a tiny little bit of just contact, a little bit of relationship, a new voice that just comes up against you, so that the barrier between what is you and what is not you gets a little thinner. And I feel like when we're writing, obviously it's an act of communication. So I'm trying to take things that are from me and bring them outside of me into a form that other people can, consume, ingest, metabolize them. And we can know each other a little bit through this act. And when we close the physical boundary of our body to the world, isolate, we're in a room, I'm, not co-working, it's just me, my brain, and my computer, or my pen and paper. um, we stop being quite so porous. And I feel like that porosity of like inner to outer goes both ways equally, right? So my inner to outer in my writing, I want that to be feel really easy. That's an easy pathway. All these ideas that are inside me, they just easily get out onto the page. That's the feeling I'm seeking. But if I don't have things that are easily coming in, that pathway feels sticky anyway, right? So the ways to get little bits of coming in are, um, create some little ad hoc writers group where you're just, sharing a little bit online, or, um, write in a public space, or co-work with somebody, or just share snippets with somebody. Even, and obviously this needs to be used judiciously based on like how you feel about it, how you react to it. But even little bits of like, I've shared a lot of clips on social media, just like, I wrote this sentence today, or I'm thinking about this idea. I build little micro communities around a passage of writing, and I'll say, I was talking about beginnings, artistic beginnings, and there's this image I was trying to use about how the heart starts beating in an embryo. But I felt really nervous that it was going to come across as like an anti-choice, like anti-reproductive rights thing, because I was talking about this beautiful thing about how a cell will just start pulsing, and then the cells around it just start pulsing, and then eventually becomes a heart that can eventually sustain a life. And I really liked the image and the metaphor, but I was a little bit itchy about whether it would be misinterpreted, and I was trying to, make some statement about embryos. And so I put it on Facebook, and I was like, "Hey, community, like, how do you read this? What would you make up about this if you didn't know me? Would you assign any political belief to it?" And, it started a big conversation. And I've had a bunch of those where I'm just like, I'm grappling with something in the book. Let me take it out into the world and ask my community. I happen to have a really great art community from having been a choreographer and director, dancer. So I've got a lot of thoughtful people who are thinking about art and relationships and meaning. So I often brought some of those questions that I was stuck with to a group.
Understood. Yeah, no, so I think it's really incredible, first off, that you've employed all these different strategies, especially the example of reaching out at the embryos. I mean, you have a question, you reach out, you get feedback, and that's only going to improve your writing for the better. It's incredible. Now, speaking of that, and speaking of the writing process itself, I was wondering if you could transition a little bit into what your physical writing process does look like. I mean, do you write from the body in the same way you teach movement? What is your typical setup like? What's a day in the writing life like for you?
Well, It's interesting. At different stages of development of the book, I've had very different needs. For a while, like I maxed out at 2 hours. Um, I will say that pretty much all the time it needs to be very quiet. I can't write with music, and if like my partner's on a call, I have to be in a different room from him. So that is a constant for me is I just need quiet. That's also part of my like neurodivergent brain. Um, I love to write where I'm really physically comfortable, so I often write from bed with my little desk set up. But in the beginning of my process, I would max out at like 2 hours. That was when I was like grappling with ideas, like what could this section be about? What is the topic? I was dragging things out of me, and I was really trying to like put together really big ideas, and I'd max out at about 2 hours. Then once I had a draft and I was like, okay, let me dig into this essay and really figure out what it needs. I really needed like full 6 to 8 hour stretches, and I wanted no interruptions. And I was okay only writing 1 day a week if I could plan for it to be an entire day of only writing, no clients, no calls, no errands, not leaving the house, hopefully no kids, right? Like trying to write when my kids are busy. But I really found that those were the days when I felt really agitated when I wouldn't get my 6 or 8 hour stretch. Um, and now that I'm editing and kind of really being very just pruning and editing and trying to get extra language out of there, I can write in like anything from a 1 to a 6 hour chunk. So it's like different brain powers, and I found that that one that needed flow could not hold on to the tension that I was trying to hold in an arc. I couldn't do it if I had to go in small chunks, but other things I either needed small chunks or I could or could not have small chunks. So it's just interesting to me how the phrasing has changed a lot based on what kind of mental functions I needed.
Understood. And I think that's incredible. You kind of like worked your way up to like the long spans of writing too, which is great. And I guess that kind of lends a hand to the fact that you are managing multiple projects at the same time right now. You mentioned you actually have more than one book that's up and coming right now. So I'm wondering if you'd like to shine a little light on the other books that you're working on.
Yeah, so the other one's a bit more like a textbook and so feels a lot less taxing to me
Mhm.
because it's got a lot of practicality to it. It's a book for music conductors about the body, embodiment and expression for music conductors through this particular practice that I teach, which is called Laban movement analysis. And it's a way to analyze the human body for meaning. And I teach it every summer to conductors and David Vickerman, who started the symposium and asked me the first year to come teach. After that first workshop, we both said, we need to write a book about this. So that's just been a like, not every week, once a week, 2 hours. He's in California. The two of us get on a Zoom call and we set of objectives for the period of time. We're usually working separately. I'm more the writer, and because he's the conductor, he holds a lot more of the technical information, but then I hold the Laban information. So often he would write something about conducting, I would write something about Laban. He would give me his conducting thing and I would clean up the writing, and I would give him my Laban thing and he would conductify it. Like he would say, "Oh, we wouldn't really use that idea," or "Really it's more like this," and then I'd clean up the writing again. So the writing always ended up like back in my lap, but a lot of the pattern recognition ended up in his lap. And then we would just keep going back and forth on our Zoom call. And sometimes one of us would have a question and we'd pop back on. But we just chipped away at it over 2 years and it's almost done now.
That's incredible. I mean, I always love to hear about these collaborative efforts that we've been talking about this entire podcast, but I think, one-on-one is a whole other situation too, as opposed to the community that you've mentioned before. Do you find it more beneficial or less, or any differences between working with a group versus one-on-one?
Well, of course, one on one when you're actually collaborating, as opposed to a group that's just there supporting you, of
Right.
course, it feels different just in that balance of control, right? Like my book, I'm in control of it, including if I decide to surrender around it and say, like, give me all your ideas, give me your suggestions, or no, I just want this, or I want feedback to be like that. But ultimately, my book is under my purview. A collaboration, of course, you're in a constant ecosystem where you're, hopefully symbiotically adapting to each other the whole time. Luckily, this particular collaborations, we have quite a division of skill and labor and passion. Like, he doesn't really like writing,
Mm.
and I know almost nothing about conducting. So, he's just this total expert in this field, and I'm just like wrapped and learn from him and love to be corrected and love for him to tell me, like, oh, it's not that. What is it? Tell me more. Um, and then, I have my own set of skills that I love to do. And he loves to hand me something and he's like, this is the idea. And then I rewrite it and he's like, oh, that sounds so good. And he's so excited. And so it's quite nice for us that we're not really overlapping all that much. Because I don't think we've ever had a fight, but there are very few like quibbles about this word or that word or this section or that section.
Understood. Yeah, thank you for kind of shining a light on that because it's always interesting to see the dynamics and how things work, and it's great that you kind of complete each other. He knows a lot about the topic, a lot about the writing practice as well. So it's a good back and forth there. So that being said, you've talked a lot about, like, the different writing strategies, the communities, and your books, but if somebody was interested in getting in touch and connecting and being a part of this, what's the best link?
Well, my website, alexandrabellerdances.org, has lots of stuff on it, including some excerpts from the book and some free classes and things like that, and also ways to contact me or um, get mentorship from me. The book, The Anatomy of Art, will be out in May, so there will eventually be a website for that. But I would say for now, just my website is the best way to find more, information and goodies.
Well, perfect. There you go. And to everybody listening, we're going to put the link in the description box of this podcast today. So you can go ahead and click over and get in touch and just learn a little bit more. So all this being said, though, I'm wondering if you happen to have one last like piece of advice that the audience today could take with them and carry into their own writing practices. What is something that you wish you knew when you first were getting started about writing that you've learned along the way?
Mm. Um, I think the difference between strength and force, and what I mean by that is if I sat down and tried to, force myself to write or force myself to have an idea, um, that never worked. But there is a strength to showing up, even if you're going to sit in front of a blank screen for a little while, and just building the fortitude and the strength that's not me forcing myself, which to me often means I'm exiling some part of myself or dissociating something or not listening to myself. But the strength to show up, but be present and feeling. And so I think sometimes we think that we need to shut out emotions that, some people might call them negative. I don't give a value to emotions as positive or negative. Feel a lot nicer to us and some of them are more challenging. But when emotions come in, I think sometimes we have a mythology that we need to like shut that out and I got to write, so I can't think about that. Everything that's inside of us is part of our writing process. That doesn't mean we're going to write about it. But if I'm sad, I need to sit there and say, yeah, I'm writing sad. I'm sitting here, I'm sad, and I'm going to write. And I'm going to see what sad writing brings today, instead of being like, no, I've got to get myself into a different mood to be able to write. No, I'm writing as me. I'm a whole person. And I have to sit here as a whole person and, see what comes out of that person today.
Understood. Yeah, I like that a lot. And I like the concept of not pushing yourself, right? If the ideas aren't coming, you need to be ready for that and be passionate about it because that's how the best writing does flow. I appreciate that. So yeah, all this being said, this has been a really profound conversation. I think that we've learned a lot about, embodied writing practices, community cultivation, and presence over performance, which I think you just give really good perspective about. I think it's something that a lot of authors can definitely relate to.
Great.
So, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a real pleasure to meet you and to hear a little bit more about your books. And to everybody listening, again, you can check out the website on the link in the description box today. And you can keep an eye out for the Anatomy of Art and her other books and coming out in May. So very exciting stuff. Really awesome. And everybody else listening today, if you're willing to write a book, you want to get out there, you have an idea for it, then go ahead and do it. Just keep writing, keep connecting, and keep moving toward the author that you're becoming. This has been the Authors on Mission podcast. Alexandra, thank you so much for joining us, and have an amazing day, everybody.
That's a wrap on another episode of the Authority on Demand podcast. If today's conversation sparked something in you, don't keep it to yourself. Share this episode with a founder or leader who's ready to stop being the best kept secret in their industry. If you want to turn your expertise into inbound demand, head to authorityondemand.com to see how we help clients go from unknown to in demand. I'm Danielle Hutchinson, and I'll catch you on the next one. Now, go build some authority.